Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and can I welcome you to the release of the third scorecard prepared by the Mercatus Centre, which looks at the quality of reporting in the federal government. This, of course, is the scorecard for the fiscal 2001 year, the reports of which were filed before the 31st of March in this year. I want to introduce to you and will further introduce later on, but just recognise the Controller General of the United States, Mr. David Walker, here, who is going to speak to you shortly. Dr. Jay Cochran, who is the author of the scorecard document. Somewhere in the audience, a colleague of ours, Steve Richardson, who was the senior researcher and responsible for quality control down the back of the room, and Miss Jen Ivey, who was the project manager. Jen somewhere else down the far at the back of the room as well. First, we're going to have a few comments by me, which will be very brief, introducing why we are involved in this particular activity, and then I'm going to ask Dr. Jay Cochran to report on his findings this year and to make some general comments, and then I'm going to ask David Walker to speak to you, and after the three of us have spoken, we're going to take questions. Starting with the fiscal year of 1999, the first year under GPRA, the major thrust of GPRA is to shift accountability from an exclusive focus on how money is spent to a focus on what public benefits arose from the spending of that money. In this environment, it was our view that the most critical factor in this process was the quality of the information made public, the fullness of the disclosure, and the credibility of government activities in solving the problems being addressed. Therefore, this scorecard is not a measure of the success or failure of government organisations to achieve their stated goals, but rather an assessment of how thoroughly they inform us on these matters. So please don't confuse it as being a judgment of the performance of organisations. In fact, there are a number of organisations that don't do particularly well in meeting their goals who get high credit from us for the quality of their reporting, because they're very open and honest and saying these are the things that we failed to achieve. They may also be good at telling us how they expect to be able to make up for that failure in the future, but it is not a measure of their performance. Since the production of the first scorecard, we have consistently tightened the rigour with which we apply our criteria to these reports. We will continue to do this until a high standard is achieved. In the first 2 years, agencies have been able to cope with this tightening of standards, but this year appears to be a zero improvement year. However, inside that general comment, some agencies spectacularly improved, while others just as spectacularly declined. Dr. Cochran will further explore this result in his comments. It is not possible to overstate the importance of quality result information to the significant managerial change that is currently occurring in the federal government. Quality information is the foundation stone on which the President's management agenda and performance budgeting are built. Absent quality result information, these initiatives will ultimately fail. In addition, these initiatives are sequential and cumulative in effect. It is not possible to transform achievement in government without these three components. What might these initiatives mean for you and me as citizens? Well, it should mean that we would know what progress is being made and what effect government programs have had on that progress. We should in future be able to tell what progress is being made on issues like homelessness, what are the causal factors, and when might it be eradicated. We should be able to tell what's the current level of improvement in the quality of health for Americans, what are the causal factors, and how much is being contributed by government. We could look at the military, and we should be able to tell from this reporting process what's happened to the state of readiness of our military and to superiority. Or if we looked at domestic security, we should be able to tell What actions are being taken? Are we more or less secure than we were before? For those who live and work in Washington, D.C., these changes will mean a move away from measuring political commitment in additional dollars spent. It will mean an ability to measure the appropriateness of decisions against a societal yardstick, which will be able to show whether or not you have improved the public benefit, whether it has remained the same, or whether it has deteriorated. For all of this, this will be a vast improvement on a system where winners and losers are determined by the receipt of more or less funding in the appropriation process. In addition, programmatic failure is most frequently addressed by voting more money with zero evidence that more money will correct the problem. In future, appropriation will be based upon the evidence of success in addressing a particular problem, and that is as it should be. It is this logic and the opportunity created by successive administrations that have focused on accountability for results that fuel this study on the quality of results reporting. We go about this process with a team of researchers. Every single one of those reports is evaluated by 3 researchers independently. They then look together to find any particular incongruous findings and eliminate those. They are then consolidated into the findings that are sent to a panel of advisors from all around the United States who are excellent and have well-established reputations in this field. By the time we compile the final report, that also is subjected to that panel of advisors so that we know with certainty that the results arrived at have been fairly done so based upon the criteria that we have used. With those few comments, I would now like to invite Dr. Jay Cochran to come to the podium and to speak to the report and our findings. Jay, thank you.
Thank you, Morris. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 3rd annual performance report, Scorecard. And I want to take a moment just to reemphasize a couple of points that Morris made, which are that we are intending to evaluate how well the agencies communicate to the American public what it is they've done in the preceding fiscal year and about what plans they have for the future. Our aim is not, it is absolutely not to evaluate what the agencies have done per se. We are not making a qualitative assessment of the agencies. So you can't draw an inference from this scoring that top scoring agencies necessarily performed well. We are simply evaluating how well they communicate what they did and how well they communicated that to ordinary citizens. Each year we apply the same criteria, but each year we raise our standards slightly. And that's consistent with the idea that the agency should be learning both from their own past successes and failures as well as the successes and failures of their peers. We broadly categorize our scoring factors into 3 major categories: transparency, public benefits, and leadership. Transparency has to do with, can you find an agency's report easily? And once you find it, is it understandable? Can an ordinary American read it and understand what the agency is doing, or is the report filled with jargon and insider language and acronyms and so on that make it difficult for anybody outside the agency to understand? Does the agency, with respect to transparency, provide data to put its current performance in some sort of context? With respect to public benefits, does the agency do a good job of translating what it does into tangible benefits that ordinary citizens can understand and appreciate? Does it attempt to demonstrate a cause and effect relationship between the actions that it undertakes and the effects that it seeks to achieve? And with respect to leadership, does the agency use the information that it produces in this report in a forward-looking fashion? Does it use it to address problems that it uncovers in this reporting process and suggest methods of correction going forward? Each of these 3 categories has 4 evaluative criteria within it. And those criteria are scored on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being poor and 5 being excellent. The minimum score, therefore, in a category that an agency can receive just simply for publishing a report is 4, and the maximum is 20. And so the top score that an agency can receive overall across all 3 categories is a 60. And just to let the cat partially out of the bag, this year, the top scoring agency received a 42, as you've probably already seen by thumbing through your information packet. But before I discuss the scoring this year, I'd like to briefly touch on how the agencies did in the past two scoring cycles in order to put this year's performance in a bit more context. 1999 was the first year that we undertook the scorecard exercise, and it was the first year that the agencies reported under the Government Performance and Results Act. And again, we're assessing the 24 agencies that are subject to the Chief Financial Officers Act. So since '99, it was a new process and a new procedure. It would be reasonable for one to expect a wide dispersion among results across the agencies. And indeed, that's exactly what you see. What we've done here is plot the leadership scores along the x-axis and the transparency scores along the y, or along the vertical axis. And the relative widths of the bubbles indicates the public benefit score that each agency received. A wider one indicates a better score, a better job that the agencies did of translating what they do into benefits that ordinary citizens can understand, and conversely for a narrower bubble. And so, as I said, we do get a wide dispersion. EPA, for example, scored well on leadership, but not so well on transparency, and just the opposite for education. DOT, USAID, and VA did well fairly much across the board. And so we got quite a wide dispersion among the results in the first year, and that's probably pretty much as one might expect. What we would expect, too, over time, though, again, this idea that the agencies are going to learn from their past performances and from those of their peers, is a compression along this northeast-southwest diagonal. And what that geometry means, simply translated, is that agencies are doing better on all the dimensions. And so we would expect the scores to compress along that northeast-southwest diagonal, and sure enough, when we move to fiscal year 2000 scorecard, that's exactly what we see. And the relative sizes of the bubbles expands for the most part. This indicates that the agencies are doing better, or they did do better in fiscal year 2000. And it was a generalized improvement across the board for the agencies. They averaged somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 6% improvement, even in light of the fact that, as we touched on just a moment ago, that we tighten our criteria, the applicability of our criteria each year. The agencies still managed to do generally better across the board. Now let's look at this year, FY 2001. What we see is the overall cluster of the scores for all the agencies more or less fell back towards the southwest corner, more or less back towards the origin. And what that indicates, or the way that we phrased it in the report, is this reflects a generalized failure to improve. That is, the ability to communicate what it is that the agencies are doing on behalf of the American public. What you'll also notice is that the relative slope, if you were to eyeball a line through this cluster, has gotten a little bit steeper, and all that means is that the agencies did relatively better on their transparency scores than they did on leadership. Overall, the scores declined about 12% this year as compared to FY 2000. So why was there this generalized failure to improve? Well, we conjectured three possible reasons for it. The first possibility is that there was a diminished level of congressional scrutiny, of oversight. And so the agencies may not have been held to as tight a standard by the Congress. That's certainly possible, although we uncovered no evidence either for or against that particular hypothesis. We simply mention it, and then I'm going to lay it on the table. The second that we have to admit objectively as researchers is that it's possible that we raised our evaluative scrutiny at a faster rate than the agencies were able to improve. Arguing against that conjecture, though, is the idea that these criteria are simple. They're well known. We notified the agencies in July and again in January of this year how we were going to apply these standards. And the fact of the matter is the agencies have improved in the past, as we showed going from '99 to 2000. And in fact, some agencies improved this year. The simplest explanation that we've come up with is that it's possible that the transition, that 2001 was fiscal year 2001 was a presidential transition year. Budgets and staffing weren't in place for the most part until about halfway to 2/3 of the way through the year for some of the agencies. So there could be this transitional loss of focus. Now, can I tell you with any degree of certainty what the relative weights are between any of these possible explanations? No, not without any further research. We simply mention these as conjectures. The real proof of the pudding will be to see how the agencies score next year. If we see this continued downward trend, then there's more serious cause for alarm. Agencies that scored well this year, coincidentally, were agencies that tended to score well last year: Transportation, VA, and Labor, Veterans Affairs, and Department of Labor. And those are 1, 2, and 3 respectively. They tended to do very well on transparency. They produced reports that were easy to understand, that were logically organized, and well put together. They tended to do a bit less well on public benefits and leadership, but that's just relative to how well they did on transparency. So I don't want to mislead you that they did poorly here, but it's just in a relative rank sense that they did less well on those criteria. Agencies that tended to score more poorly were HHS, Office of Personnel Management, and the Department of State. And as you might expect, being at the bottom of the heap, they tended to score poorly across the board, across all the criteria that we evaluated them on. Just to pick one out at random here, State failed even to address any future management challenges, which goes to the leadership criteria. Now, surely in a post-9/11 world there must be some, but they simply didn't discuss any, and that cost them on their leadership scores. It's important to point out here that 2 agencies were not scored. One was the Department of Defense and the other was Education. Defense did not release their report in time for us to evaluate it, and our deadline was mid-April. The Department of Education, as far as we know, did not prepare a report, so we couldn't evaluate it. There were big changes this year, as I already suggested. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission literally leaped from the very bottom of the heap, from 21st place last year to 4th, to a tie for 4th this year. And they did an excellent job in transparency in terms of simplifying the very complex matters that they deal with and translating them into things that ordinary citizens could understand. They provided a lot of data to put their performance into context. The only drawback there was that the data weren't verified by an independent agency, like by the Inspector General, GAO, or by an outside auditor. They may have very well done that. They simply didn't indicate it in the report, and so we couldn't give them high marks across the board for that. The largest fall was exhibited by the U.S. Agency for International Development. They literally fell off a cliff from 3rd last year to 18th this year. The report was absolutely incoherent, and the data that they did present was in summary form, so there was no way to verify, even looking at the data without independent verification, where these results came from that they presented, and the data lacked any kind of independent validation and verification. The agency claimed in the report that they were reorganizing, but it begged the question, what are they using to guide this reorganization if they don't have reliable data upon which to make those judgments? So what? So what does all this mean? Who cares? The bottom line here is that, or we believe, is that Americans have a right to know what benefits they're receiving from their government and what those benefits cost. In this town, it's important for policymakers over on the Hill and across the street to understand in a clear fashion what the agencies are doing with the resources that they're being given. From a very practical perspective, with respect to the agencies themselves, the President's management agenda and his indication that he's going to be employing performance-based budgeting are critical factors. And we would argue that none of this, whether it's performance-based budgeting, the President's management agenda, or the ability to make informed policy choices, can be done without reliable, credible information. In other words, information that's transparent, that's benefits-oriented, and that looks to the future. In sum, the good performance reports are just the first building block of a process of ensuring a government that's accountable to its citizens. To put it in the economic language that I'm used to dealing with, high-quality reports are a necessary but insufficient element in this accountability process. We have to have it first, but they are not an end in themselves. So with this, I'd like to turn it back over to Morris to introduce David.
Thank you, Jay, and Jay will be prepared to take your questions in a few moments. It's now my great pleasure to introduce to you the Comptroller General of the United States, Mr. David Walker, to make some comments. David, thank you.
Thank you, Maurice, very much. It's a pleasure to be here. As you've heard this morning already, or this afternoon, the Mercatus project is all about performance and accountability. And it's about trying to enhance transparency as a means to promote increased performance and in order to assure accountability. I mean, as the Chief Accountability Officer of the U.S. government, as the Chief Executive Officer of the General Accounting Office, I have to deal with this every day. This is a major challenge. Let me say at the outset, congratulations to the Transportation, the Veterans, and the Labor Departments for their gold, silver, and bronze medal performance. Let me also say, shame on the Education Department. I am shocked and disappointed that an agency evidently decided not to prepare a performance and accountability report. The American people have a right to know what they're getting for their hard-earned taxpayer dollars. And the Education Department has a responsibility to report. This is not optional, and it is unacceptable for anybody to think that it is. At a time where the Education Department is calling for increased transparency and accountability for schools, it should practice what it preaches, and it's unacceptable to do anything else. So I'm hopeful that I was misinformed that they've decided not to do a report. And hopefully, if that was the case, they'll provide it, and if they don't do one this year, that they won't make the same mistake again. But with that, I think we all know that if you want to try to achieve results, you need incentives for people to do the right thing. You need transparency to provide reasonable assurance that the right thing is done, and you need to have appropriate accountability if the right thing is not done. Given recent tragic events of the last year, given known trends and challenges that we faced, and given the significant long-range fiscal imbalance that this nation faces due to known demographic trends and rising health care costs, it is critically important that we re-examine what is the proper role for the federal government, how should the federal government do business, and who should perform various functions, whether it be federal, state, local, public sector, private sector, not-for-profit sector. Performance and accountability reporting is an important element to all of this. What is the mission? What are you trying to accomplish? How are you allocating your resources and setting your priorities? And what results and outcomes do you achieve for the resources, both human, financial, and other, that you have been provided? Now, the Mercatus Center obviously just evaluated, as I noted, the 24 CFO Act agencies. And others that do evaluations also typically do the same thing. The GAO is not subject to the Government Performance and Results Act, the CFO Act, the Klinger-Cohen Act, etc. But we voluntarily comply because it's the right thing to do. And I would commend to you our Performance and Accountability Report, which I would respectfully suggest is as good or better than any out there, and is on our website, and I would commend it to you, www.gao.gov. For example, $26.4 billion in financial benefits last year, a return on investment of 69-1, #1 in the world for accountability organizations. But we could do better, and we're going to try to do better this year. Progress has been made since '99. You know, frankly, the government is a lag indicator on a lot of things. You know, financial management, accountability reporting, strategic planning. But we've made some progress, and some agencies have really made great progress, but we've got a long way to go. We really do need to do a better job of matching resources to results. We need to do a better job of linking institutional and individual performance measurement reward systems to desired outcomes. That's how you make meaningful progress and accelerate that progress. And we need to recognize reality, and that is the numbers just don't add up long term. And so as a result, if we want to minimize tax burdens, if we want to maximize positive outcomes for taxpayer dollars, that performance and accountability reporting is an integral part of that. So I thank you for the work that you've done, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's now an opportunity to ask questions and have those questions answered. Can I ask both David and Jay if they would come up and join me here at the moment? If you have questions for a particular individual, would you please indicate to whom you're addressing your question? And there are some microphones that are being carried around the room so that people can be adequately heard. First question. Yes, ma'am.
Overall, what do agencies still need to work on as a whole?
Could you just repeat the question so that people down the back can hear?
Sorry. Overall, what do agencies still need to work on as a whole?
I think that the three major criteria, they need to work on being much more transparent. That's the right that we as citizens have to know what's going on. They need to work much more on leadership. That's the last of the criteria we apply. Both of those things are entirely in the control of the agency. It's not difficult to be able to predict what you expect you're going to do in the future, what your challenges are, and how you might address them. It's also not very difficult to make certain that whatever it is that you're posting for people to see is readily accessible and readable. So everybody should be able to score well on those two criteria. Defining the public benefits is the more difficult of the three, and we would expect that as we tighten the criteria, that will become more and more of a challenge. It's more difficult for some organizations because what they do is not as easily identifiable in terms of public benefits as the activities of other organizations. If you just count money up and decide whether it went in the right box, that's relatively easy to do. But if you have to assess the impact that you had on democratization around the world, as the State Department has to do, then that's much more difficult to be able to get a measure of that. But David, maybe you would like to make a comment on that question as well.
I think that's fine. I think the fact of the matter is there are differing degrees of difficulty in defining desired outcomes. To the maximum extent possible, you want things that are measurable. Many things are measurable in quantitative terms, but some things aren't. I mean, if you take GAO, for example, we have financial benefits, which is in a dollar term, but things like improving safety, security, enhancing privacy, those are things that you can point to concrete results and actions that might have been accomplished during the period, but they don't always lend themselves to translation into dollar terms. And so it will be a continuous struggle to try to come up and improve the measures, but it can be done.
Okay. Next question. Yes, sir, down the back. Yes, sir. I'll take your question over here next.
Hi. Would you say that any of the agencies used a model process for preparing these reports? And if not, could you outline what one might be?
I don't think that we could identify that anybody has developed a model process yet. Transportation is probably the best that we've seen so far at being able to link everything from its strategic plan through its annual plan to its results. I would attribute a great deal of that to the work that Mort Downey did while he was there, because he was really a believer in this field. And I don't necessarily think that one model will work in exactly the right way for every organization. But what I do know is that for those organizations that saw themselves in the most recent budget ranked as moderately effective, ineffective, or unknown, you better get to be either known or effective pretty quickly, otherwise somebody's going to say there's no justification in giving you money in future. I think that's going to be a major driving force. As OMB also links budget requests to performance information, then the evidence is going to need to be on the table to justify the request for additional monies in future. I think those are going to be things that will drive organizations to be much more precise in what it is that they are able to show that they accomplished and what kind of benefit that produced for the American people. That will bring different solutions, I think, for different organizations. But the linking of those three things, I think, is an element that needs to be apparent in every one of them: strategic plan, annual plan, results. Yes, sir. I'll take your question at the back and then yours, sir.
Yes, this question is for David Walker. David, in the experience of the GAO, to what extent have you found that the slow progress in responding to the President's management agenda, as we experienced with the GPRA, is due to confusion and a lack of certainty on the part of agency officials as to exactly what actions to take and how to get to those goals? OMB's guidance has been vague in the past and continues to be that way. I'd like your thoughts about that.
Well, first, we really have not issued any reports recently that evaluate the agency's progress on so-called getting to green, if you will. I think from a conceptual standpoint, it makes a lot of sense in order to try to be able to take those 5 priority management agendas, which, by the way, bear a very close coordination to GAO's high-risk list, and that's not an accident, and to try to translate those into a short list of specific items that OMB is expecting for the secretaries and their people to be able to focus on, and to not only show where they stand as of a point in time, but also what progress they're making. Because I think, many times you're talking about having to do things that are going to take a number of years in order to get to where you need to be. So it's important to be able to let people see whether or not reasonable progress is being made and to reflect that in the rating system. I undoubtedly expect, in fact know, that GAO will be monitoring progress and trying to evaluate to what extent what are some of the common denominators or best practices for those that have made progress quickly, and what are some of the impediments or obstacles or concerns that those haven't made progress, and why. And so maybe after we do that, I'll be able to answer your question more definitively.
There was a question over that question there. Right, thank you.
I have a question in 2 parts that are related. Almost half of the reports that you looked at, the performance reports, were folded into an overall accountability report. And I guess my question there is, how does that, considering that the accountability reports are a lot more than a performance report, and the material that you'd look for in a performance report may or may not be in the performance report section, it could well be in other parts of the document. How does that affect the review that you do, and particularly the transparency and understandability issues? And the second part of the question is that next year, my understanding is that the agencies will be required, all of them, to issue a performance and accountability report, a combined report. And therefore, how do you think that will affect your evaluations?
In the first 2 years, we noticed that there was a wide dispersion of organizations that chose either to report independently in their annual report or to report in a combined manner through their accountability report. What we do is that we look for the segment that's identified as the annual report, and we pull that out and we judge that part of the organization's performance. In looking at where they came from in the past, there were good reports that were published independently, and there were good reports that were published in the combined manner. I think that you really get down to 2 things that determine whether or not the report's going to be good. Does the report writing team have a clear focus on what it is that it's trying to communicate to the different publics that it's addressing? Is the quality of the information that they're using giving them a clear picture of what happened to the organization during the last year? The way in which you put the reports together, whether they're combined or independent, doesn't matter. If one of those elements is missing, then I don't think that you're going to produce a good report. So I think that the ability of the report writing team to have a clear focus on exactly what it is that it's trying to portray is very important, and the quality of the data that's available to them to be able to put together that report is absolutely critical. Outside of this process, I've talked to 1 or 2 organizations who are really working on information that they don't collect firsthand, but is about 18 months old. So they're relying on information that preceded the financial year under review by about 6 months. How can you give a reasonable assessment of what it is that you're doing if you're not even dealing with information that comes out of the year that's being reported on? One of the big challenges is going to be for organizations to get real-time information on what it is that they're doing. And I think that that's going to have to be a big focus for both OMB, the President's management agenda, and for organisations right across government, getting real-time information so that you know exactly what it is that you're doing. Imagine a bank manager who only found out 18 months afterwards what was happening to the level of his deposits and withdrawals. He wouldn't be a bank manager for very long. Exactly the same for these huge organisations that belong to the government. You expect to know in real time exactly what it is that you're currently achieving. Yes, ma'am. There's a question just behind there, Curtis.
Thank you. I work at the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, Mr. Walker, and a relatively small federal agency. Do you have any plans to include them in the number of agencies that you will be looking at? Because I think personally, I think we do rather well in informing the public, so I want to know if we will ever be included in that number.
Frankly, we looked at how wide we should actually take the studies, and we have to make a compromise. And the compromise is that unless we publish this information very quickly after the reporting period, it doesn't have a great deal of usefulness. So that means that we really have to confine it down, and it became an easy choice to decide let's just do the CFO agencies. But as Mr. Walker indicated, they look at many more organisations. They look at all of the organisations from time to time, and they look at them in a similar way, but they also look at what was being achieved by that organisation as well. We don't have any plans to extend this further than it is at the moment, because OMB intends to tighten the time frame in which you have to complete your annual reports, and they're going to have to be ultimately published sometime in November. That's very appropriate in our view, because this should be information that you can use when you're formulating budget requests. There's not much point in having this information available to you after the President's budget has been delivered. That, I think, is going to put everybody under a lot more pressure. We would also want to be able to look at those things, so I think that a manageable number of reports is probably going to be one of our rules. Yes.
First, let me say I used to be head of the PBGC, so I'm not totally objective and independent here. But let me also say, to touch on what Maurice said, the Joint Financial Management Improvement Program, which I chair, the principals, which are the Secretary of the Treasury, Director of OMB, Director of OPM, and myself, have agreed on a number of things over the last 8 months, one of which is the acceleration of required annual reporting by the agencies, as well as for the consolidated financial statements and reporting of the U.S. government. I believe it's in 04 that the agencies will have to report by November 15th, and the consolidated financial statements for the government will come out by December 15th, and that's fully appropriate. I mean, you know, having reporting, 6+ months after the end of the year just doesn't get it in the 21st century. But this is not only from the standpoint of performance and accountability, but it's also to prevent efforts by certain agencies to reconfigure their books after the end of the year, rather than dealing with the underlying problems, to be able to close their books in a timely manner, and to be able to have timely, accurate, and useful information to be able to make informed management and financial decisions every day.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was just curious, what are the immediate consequences for an agency if they don't turn in a performance report?
I'm going to give David an opportunity to do that, but having been a politician at one stage and having sat in a legislature in the Parliament, I think that the Parliament or the legislature should have something to say about not complying with the statute.
The first consequence is you get criticized by the Chief Accountability Officer of the United States government and publicly. And what happens after that, let's wait and see.
There's one question here, and then I'll come to you.
Yeah, I see that as I look at the report, that over half of the agencies did not have their performance results verified and validated. And I guess this is the question for Dr. Cochran there. Are they expecting to do this going forward, to verify and validate these results so people can rely on them?
That would be my understanding, and there's no other way for, again, our standard being the ordinary citizen. we rely as citizens on validation by outside entities, whether they're auditors, the GAO, or the Inspector General. And so your observation is a good one. There were a lot of agencies that didn't validate their data. Some of them weren't, they frankly admitted they didn't and weren't able to. And so that got them good scores on part of the transparency, but also bad scores on their data. So
I think clearly we're moving to a future where you have a consolidated performance and accountability report and where auditors will have a increased responsibility with regard to validation of key performance information. Right now, for example, in our report, we publish a consolidated performance and accountability report, and our auditors have a responsibility, our external auditors have a responsibility to review to determine whether or not there are any material inconsistencies between what's being reported and what they became aware of as part of their examination. That is different from having an affirmative responsibility to provide some type of attestation with regard to this, and I think we're headed to that.
Writing.
Could you talk more about USAID as a case example in terms of the relative inputs that come from the Congress that doesn't seem to know what it wants the agency to do, which would make it a little difficult, a White House that, let's say, is changing drastically how it thinks the agency should work, and an agency that, this is your methodology, that last year ranked so high when it didn't really seem to have much measurable results, and this year when measurement is becoming very important and let's say they are beginning to look at a whole change in criteria and measurement of what they do, they get very low marks. What is the significance of this great drop?
Okay. I'm not going to comment on the performance or a perceived performance of USAID. One of the interesting things about USAID in its early reporting was that it looked at each of the projects that USAID funded around the world, and it did an excellent job of linking those into what benefits the American public might be able to expect from those particular activities. What it wasn't able to do as well was to actually show whether that expectation was ever borne out in reality, but it was that quality of its reporting that actually got it good marks in the early years. This year there was a very different style to its reporting, and which makes us suspect that perhaps there's been significant changes in the report writing team, and there is also clearly some changes in views about where USAID will go in the future. What we would expect to see is that, particularly in a transition year, is that the opportunity that taken in the third criteria of the reporting process that we use, that is leadership, starts to articulate how the benefits from the new policies will be superior to those policies that have been adopted by a previous administration. Some of that was evident in the reports across this year, but not a great deal of it. And as far as I'm concerned, I think that that was an opportunity lost for agencies, that they didn't actually look at what their new policy positions would be and how they expected that to materially impact the benefits to the American public. Further questions? I've got one right down the back, and then I'll take...
Yeah, for Mr. Walker, could you comment on what responsibility Congress has to consider these reports in making appropriation decisions?
I think in time, as the quality and the timeliness of the reporting improves, that it is appropriate for the Congress to give a consideration in trying to ascertain what works and what doesn't work. I mean, you know, what policies and what programs are achieving the desired objectives and outcomes, and to what extent does there need to be a reassessment and a reallocation of resources based upon demonstrable results. I will tell you that, unfortunately, in the past, my experience has been that sometimes the agencies that were a basket case ended up getting more money. I mean, the ones that had fundamental problems and needed resources to deal with their problems. Now, sometimes that's fully appropriate. It's fully appropriate if you have a problem and it needs human or financial resources to solve the problem to be able to do that. On the other hand, we're just in the early stages, I think, of the Congress being able to use this type of data for making informed resource allocation decisions. And I expect that they will do more, and I clearly believe that they need to do more in that area.
Thank you. Carl?
Sir, this is a question for you, Mr. Walker. You have discussed that performance and accountability reports are probably going to be combined. As you know, many departments and agencies also combine their annual performance plans with their annual program performance reports. Are we not going towards a time when we're going to see all three combined?
Well, we've already combined all three at GAO, which may be a leading indicator. I would think it's likely that we will probably head in that direction.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Can I ask you to join me in thanking David Walker for being here today, and also for Jay Cochran and his team for the work that they did. Thank you. Can I just make these comments to you in closing? First, remember that what we looked at was the quality of the information that was put in the reports and its ability to be able to inform the American public. That we consider that to be a crucial element of the change that we're seeing inside government. That ultimately that change that we're seeing will take Washington away from a focus that says that winners and losers are people who get more money, to a deliberative judgment on the evidence of whether or not benefit was produced by this organization, and that monetary allocations will be predicated on the quantity of benefit that was produced by these activities. That's a very different world, but it's a world that's greatly improves the status quo that we have currently. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We very much appreciate your attendance.